The autumn webinars are aiming to deepen knowledge about topics like oral history, migration, empathy building, intersubjectivity, understanding identity, and relationships. All webinars will be recorded and made available on our website, www.ion.museum. And please note that we will ask you kindly to answer a survey after the ended webinar. Identity on the Line is co-funded by Creative Europe and the program of the European Union. So, a very short overview over the 5 webinars which will follow. Today, we are going to listen to Professor Dr. Luisa Passerini, who will be properly presented in just a second. One week from now, on Friday the 16th, you are very much welcome to join us for Dr. Elif Gökçek'ten, Designing for Empathy with the Oneness Mindset. On Friday, the 23rd of October, we will listen to Professor Dr. Peter Gitrell, Reckoning with Refugee Voices in Modern World History. Thursday, the 29th of October, we will have the pleasure to present Amina Kravac, the War Childhood Museum, From Project to Museum, From Museum to Global Movement. And on Thursday, the 5th of November, we will have a lecture from Professor Dr. Pamela Bellinger, The World That Refugees Need. So we hope we'll see you all then as well. But now I'm looking very much forward to the session today, and I give the floor to you, Kaja, please.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I am really honored and happy to introduce Professor Dr. Luisa Passerini. Luisa Passerini is a Professor Emerita at the European University in Florence, and she was the Principal Investigator of the European Research Council project Bodies Across Borders, Oral and Visual Memory in Europe and Beyond from 2013 to 2018. She has studied the subjects of social and cultural change, the African liberational movement, the movements of workers, students, women in the 20th century, and the mobility of migrants through Europe in the last decade. Here, she has used memory in its oral, written, and visual forms, developing the concept of subjectivity and intersubjectivity in historical research. She has taught as a professor of cultural history at the Università di Torino in Italy and in many different universities of various European and other countries, also in America. So I'm very glad to introduce Luisa, and Luisa, the floor is yours. And for all the participants, you can ask questions. You can write down the questions with the icon questions and answer, or through the chat. And Luisa will answer the question at the end of the lecture. So Luisa, you can start. And shall I share the screen?
Well, let us try to. Thank you so much, both Kaja and Catherine, for your generous words. I'm very, very glad and honored to be here. And in fact, I will talk about largely about the project that was mentioned by Kaja, but not only, because I really see this moment as a moment of recapitulating my research on subjectivity and intersubjectivity, which has been going on for many years. Now, the project for the ERC, the European Research Council, was called Bodies Across Borders, Oral and Visual Memory in Europe and Beyond. And the cluster of concepts that emerged was visuality, mobility, and intersubjectivity, and the relationship between them. Can you see? Can everybody see the first slide of my PPT or not? Yes. Okay. Right. And I have something here. What is it?
I'm doing it. So I'm changing, not you.
Okay.
It's okay.
So this is the first. Are you actually managing it, Kaja?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So this is the first slide I want to present, because it is a slide reflecting the countries of origins of the participants in the research. The research was composed largely of interviews, oral and visual interviews with people who are usually called migrants. this research brought us to question terminology, because the interviewees themselves did not like, in the most part, the term migrant. They prefer to be called travelers, mobile people, and they didn't equally like the term refugee, because these terms are charged with negative aspects and negative connotations. So this is just to give you a very brief idea of the countries of origins. First of all, this research was not quantitative. It's not representative in terms of quantity, but it is in terms of quality, in the sense that many countries of the world are reflected, and especially those which are connected with Europe through migration. You will notice especially the Horn of Africa, because of Italian colonialism, the Maghreb, and the certain areas in South America, such as Peru and Eastern Europe. Now, the following slides shows that one of the major intentions of the project, which was to enlarge the study of memory from oral and written, which I mean a number of oral historians have done for decades, since the 60s and 70s. Orality and transcribing the recordings has been the major point of reference for oral history. Now, my challenge in this project was to enlarge the attention to memory to visuality, because I was inspired by visual art. Since between 2005, 2010, I was able to see a number of products of video arts and photography, which suggested the idea that we cultural historians could also use visuality in some way if we found bridges between their work and ours. The first, can I see the next
Yes.
slide? Okay, this first slide, this is really the video that an artist, Ursula Beaman, and Angela Sanders produced on the passage from Africa to Europe in Gibraltar. And these images have become typical of our images of migration. But these two stills represent the bodies of women who are moving. They actually put on a number of clothes that they will then sell in Spain. And this is an example of a video essay, which means, first of all, a collaboration between disciplines, anthropology and art. And also it means an effort to show the relationship between the individuals and the world. If you go to the next slide, we see another video essay, more famous, by Ursula Beaman, which concerns the history of the Sahara, a very contested area for centuries. And here it is indicated the particular method that the artist uses. She uses a systemic approach, which implies a critique of the capitalistic system, which extends to world dimension and involves thousands and thousands of people, which are shown collectively. But she also gives space. Please pay attention to this question, because it connects to my own project. There are two individual interviews within this video essay, which is actually 78 minutes long. It's a rather long one, but there is space for individuals, one of whom is Adawa, the man that you see. This is the stuff of movement. And this man participated in the Tuareg rebellion, but he does as a job, the broker. He's a broker. He gets money from mobile people to transport them from the desert for instance, from Mali to Libya. So he is very conscious, very aware of this. In his interview, he says, I am living in the interstices of legality. I'm not legal. So my place in the process of movement is a place of somehow clandestinity and at the margins of legality. You will see later on how this connects with other types of interviewees and individuals. So the relationship starts to appear from these videos between the individual and the collective. The gigantic movement of populations, the migrations that Catherine was mentioning, always have this double dimension, the individual and the collective. And we must take care of this, pay much attention to this connection. The next artist, Victor Lopez Gonzalez, again, this is the very same place and the very same, not people, but type of people. Also the next slide is the same thing. Can you show it? These women, they're called turtle women because they transport these enormous ways. The artist has compared them to Atlas, the mythological figure. He was one of the titans who rebelled against Zeus in ancient Greek mythology. And he's carrying the weight of the world. And so Victor Lopez Gonzalez says, these women are carrying the weight of globalization. But differently from the first artist, from Ursula Beaman, I showed, he's not interested so much in showing the systemic, the world, but in showing the individuals. So there are choices that can be done artistically, but also disciplinarily in the field of research and oral history. And these are two ways of representing movement. The next one, the next slide, shows a third artist whose name is Eva Leitner, German artist. The first one is, I mentioned, is Swiss, and the second Spanish. She is German, and she has chosen to concentrate as a photographer on absence, emptiness. This is done on purpose in order to show that the borders of Europe are not necessarily to be seen as crowded with people trying to invade Europe. On the contrary, they are places also of solitude. And can you show the next slide, please? Yes, and of desolation to some extent. The artist insists that these images be always shown with a writing near to them in order to complement the visual and the written. Please notice this connection. Of course, the written is visual, but we are not often accustomed to put the two together as two different types of visuality, which on the contrary will come out very clearly in the course of the collection of visual memory that we try to do. So all the exhibitions by Lightolf always have the written near the visual. This project is called Postcards from Europe, and it's in progress. It's going on forever because there is a continuous production by the artist of similar slides. Do notice that she intends this as a critical approach to the visuality of mobility, because it's against the media which show crowded boats and crowded camps and so on. And the final artist I want to show briefly is Bushra Kalli from Casablanca. This is a series of 8 images, 8 videos. This one image from them called Mapping Journey, in which various interviewees whose faces are never shown, but only their hands. Draw their itineraries on a map. And here is a crucial point for also the configuration of the issue of mobility in our research projects. She uses the traditional map. The map you see of Africa and the Mediterranean is the conventional map adopted by the Western world and by Western geography, traditional geography, our scientific geography. And she moves it, she changes through the drawing by the person who is interviewed, but her intervention, the next slide, please, which is the itinerary transformed into a constellation. So there are 8 mapping journeys and 8 constellations, and the constellations shows an abstraction which reminds, in the intention of the artist, us of the memory of nomads who drew their itineraries in the sand of the desert, the memory of Arabic astronomy and astrology, and the connection between the sea and the sky. Sorry to have shown these wonderful works of art so quickly, but this was just an introduction, because this is the word from where the inspiration for the research project came. And the idea was, the idea generated by these images was, first of all, that that visual art is often more vocal and expressive about the condition of Europe and the people who move towards and within Europe than history, sociology have been. And so my idea was that there are, first of all, art is a mode of knowledge. And as a mode of knowledge, it can inspire our own modes of knowledge and research. So the project that was designed started from this idea, right? That there was a team of people working, 2 teams working in Italy and the Netherlands. And we would approach people who had been the subjects of mobility in the last 20 years. And we would approach them usually in public places like schools, people who were following courses to learn the language of the country of arrival, or in squares, in stations, or through networks of friends. As I say, it's a qualitative research, so it follows an anthropological move rather than a quantitative sociology one, sometimes in their private houses. Now, the request was, well, first of all, we showed, whenever possible, some of the images I showed you, the work by artists, and then discussed a bit with them, these images. And then ask the question, would you accept to give some visual representation of your journeys? And this question became the focus of actually a controversy between us interviewers and the interviewees, an implicit controversy. It was not open. It came out through their replies. And the first evidence of this was resistance, for various forms of resistances. The first one was, the next slide, please. Thank you, Kaja. This was the most evident resistance, a white sheet. She gave, these were big sheet, 48 by 33 centimeters, large ones. And we gave them in schools, pastels, colors. When the interview took place in station or squares, it was just pencils and pens. And Antonella Dascalescu did not hide her name. She didn't ask for pseudonym, which many people did. Show her, it is the next slide. Yes, and she is from Romania. born in 1980, and the interpretation of the white sheet is not so obvious, because at first I did interpret it as I just said. This is a resistance to our ethnocentrism and Eurocentrism. It's more complicated than that, because then she explained why the sheet was white. It was white because she said it's impossible to render the visuality of my memory. It's I need something else. I need I would need images that I have done myself during my journey. So there is this complicacy in behind the request of giving a visual memory. This sort of resistance and other ones led me, but in particular, to question my own approach. Who am I? From which positionality am I asking this question of drawing and or drawing or bringing a photograph? Many brought photographs. Some you will see some. So it was a reply that sort of reversed the order, the sense of the project, and induced us to reflect on our own subjectivity. Actually, it was a form of a request of intersubjectivity, of reviewing the concept. And the next slide shows, in the beautiful words by Edouard Glissant, the question of opacity. The right, he said, for a long time, we have been thinking, we people of the world, of the oppressed world, have been requesting visibility. Now we also want the right to opacity, the right not to expose ourselves, not to be used as images, not be instrumentalized from the visual point of view. And this is something that has to become a principle. Not only in the ethical procedures, asking every time for authorization, for eventually pseudonym, for very often it's not as simple as asking somebody to sign an authorization. It has to be recorded, it has to be explained that the person does not speak the language or does not read. Although I don't want at all to reduce the literacy of these people. Some are highly literate in spite of what they have, the state to which they have been reduced. Another type of resistance is documented in the next slide. This big drawing represents the family of Fabiola Samaniego, in Ecuador, from Ecuador. You see her in traditional custom and her 4 children, 3 boys and 1 girl. Now, where is the resistance here? She said, I want to represent my journey. But as soon as she was in front of the white page, she started crying. And I begged her to stop. We said, you can talk, you see, she has written a lot also on her. She wanted to go on, and so we did this work together, not in the sense that I drew anything, but I stayed with her all the time. And she produced this image, and then she presented to the class. Can we see Fabiola in the next slide? And this, all the, by the way, look, in the classes there were the traditional maps. So people knew what the traditional images are. But she showed one of these images that we called emotional maps, geography of emotion. Now, in the oral presentation, Fabiola was, so this is important because the link oral, written, visual came out very clearly. She was extremely vocal, very vibrant, and she told her story of coming to Italy for 7 years to work in a family as a badante, we say, somebody who takes care of the old. And then she finally could have her children sent to join her. And at the end of this wonderful presentation, very theatrical, she said, this all was thanks to God, there is no husband. So claiming responsibility for herself. Her resistance was largely emotional, while the resistance of the next, this is Yusef. Now, Yusef was born in Morocco, and he transformed the initial of his map, the Y, into the itinerary of his journey. This abstraction has some figurative images like Curitiba, the place where he started from, and Grenoble. These places are indicated by little hearts because the first one is where his mother is, the second where his fiancée lives and works. This map, I don't interpret it simply as a transformation due to an Islamic decision, so this Islamic inspired decision to use the abstract rather than the figurative, but also to a more complex idea. Again, Yusef said, oh, he was interviewed twice, one collectively in front of the class and one separately, individually, some months later. And he explained that the Y is a sign of destiny. My initial reflected my itinerary. Please note that the itinerary has a leg that goes towards the future. He has not yet been to Brussels and Paris. He plans to go there. So the movement is, mobility is without end, so to say. Let us see him, his face. This is it during the individual interview. Now, this resistance that I've tried to explain to the visual may be due to, for instance, why this was not really made explicit, but I could guess it at some point that people said, why are you asking us to draw or bring images? Are you thinking that we are not able to speak and write? It was like attributing a childish state. Children use images more. And so many people handed in a written. I just, I cannot show them, but for instance, if you can see this page is the map of a man, Mihail Tildea. It's entirely written. This is my book, which came out of this research. So the return to the written is a sign of that, of the advancement to the written, of that cluster of ideas that I was trying to mention before, graphism and writing as a form of visuality, which is actually at the origin of the visual expression. I used here the work of the anthropologist Jack Goody, who insisted on the connection between drawing, graffiti, drawing in the form of graphism, and writing, the origin of writing, the origin of, and so this resistance is revealed more than we thought at first. But then there were, on the contrary, many who were quite happy to present their maps. And The next image shows this is the map by AbdulSuse, who went from Mali to Libya and then to Italy, Lampedusa, also full of writing, because AbdulSuse said in his oral presentation, you see the oral and the visual were really inseparable, and the written, because the people were always asked to present their maps in the classrooms. And or to a group of people, if we interviewed out of, for instance, groups in a community of Peruvian in Florence. Now, Abdul said, I cannot really draw, which also meant, can you draw, I think? And so it was an indirect request. And then he gave a speech, very, very long. So everybody in the classroom grew rather impatient, because his story was continuously punctuated by the insertion of direct discourse, such, I said, brothers, and then a speech that he gave to his companions in the migration, on the migration route. And it is serpentine. The oral presentation is tortuous, sinuous, and serpentine, like the visual one. And he can you show him coming right after? He is one of the people that were helped by people like Adawa. So we can see at this point how at the two extremes of mobility, of migration, there are individuals that act in different ways. Abdul had to give all his money, all the money he had saved through the help of his parents in Bamako, where he was born, to people like Adawa. So the complexity, I mean, even the individual stories bring to us the complexity of the word. It's not, I claim that our micro-historical approach on the individual case and small groups brings us to the word. And now I want to come to Europe, and particularly to the map by Marichika Nazie. Now, the interesting thing in this map is that she started from Romania and went through Hungary, Austria, and then Italy, where she had relatives. Now, first thing that strikes one is east here is not, as usually on the left of the page, is at the bottom. So this geography changes the geography of Europe in the sense that it becomes ascensional from the bottom to the top. And the cardinal points, east, west, are completely changed. And also, the different colors indicate states of mind, not so much different countries. This opens a whole chapter on the borders of Europe. Where does the European Union start? Where do people feel that they are in Europe? Because look, at the time when she did the trip, she went through countries like Hungary and Romania, which were not yet part of the European Union, became later on. And yet they are not signed. This is not significant in this type of movement. So the conception of European borders inside and outside is very problematic. Marichika, can we show her? Here is she doing her. I have very long stories by people like her, but I don't have the time to tell them. But they are universes of discourse. She's interesting because the next slide shows, we were in class and the teacher asked to write a composition, a written composition in Italian, of course, because Italy was the country of arrival and the dominant country in this case, called The Emotions of the Journey, Le Emozioni del Viaggio, in which she told how terrible, she wrote how terrible this trip represented that we saw before was, how she had been obliged to sleep in forests where dogs and other animals were threatening, and it was a real nightmare. That she presents as this is why also we talk about geography of emotion. She presents as characteristic of the trip. I want to show immediately after another person, Ludmila, who did more or less the same trip. She was coming from Moldova, and this is one of the cases where I would like to show the next slide. Okay, this is, can you please look at this image? You see that some, first observation, some of the countries that compose a traditional map are not there. If there is not the former Yugoslavia, for instance. And Italy and Moldova are very similar, except that Moldova appears bigger than Italy. Again, a geography of the heart, perhaps. But if you look at the next slide, you see that actually there are lots of countries missing. And it's not that, I don't think it's that is due to the fact that Ludmila ignored that these countries exist. I think that this is due to the role, this representation is due to the role that the Mediterranean has taken up in the imagination, in the imaginary of us all. The Mediterranean has become omnipervasive. And so this is what comes out of the image. I don't think I have much more time, but I'm coming to my last part, my fourth part, which is on intersubjectivity. And let me just say that of what I showed you, we interviewed around 400 people, and they produced around 1,000 visual and written images, and everything has been deposited at the historical archives of the European Union in Florence, and is accessible to the public with the ethical limitations due to privacy. And for instance, minors cannot be shown. Their face cannot appear in any way. So the archiving process is something that was very present in our project. It was a central idea. We also explored, one of us explored the concept of cultural archive, the European cultural archive, as a way to understand what we were doing, not only the literal archive, but both were important. So intersubjectivity means many things, especially if we consider it not only from the point of view of its literal meaning, relationship between the subjects, but also between two cultural worlds. And the question is, how does it become a methodological tool? And this depends very much on the type of research one is engaged in. The first example I'm bringing is, you will see, I did the research in the 1970s. At the end of the 1970s, my first large research in oral history on the memory of fascism among the working classes. This was a typical oral history research with interviews to, for instance, these women, they were all factory workers, many in Fiat, some in the industry connected with, and all of them had been of a leftist attitude and often participating in the resistance. The next slide shows one of them who didn't want her name to be, Lucia is a pseudonym. Now, what was the characteristic of this research? That we were coming out, I mean, myself and some of my colleagues, from the hopes and defeat of '68. 10 years had gone by, but in Italy, '68 lasted 10 years. And as Stuart Hall said, cultural history, and I can say this type of cultural history, was born out of a defeat. So we went back to the factories, but no longer to ask the workers to participate in the creation of a revolutionary party. Rather, we interviewed old workers on what they had felt and done in the period of the fascist dictatorship between the wars. There was the intersubjectivity here was characterized by a sort of concomitance of world views, in the sense that for us, they were still the subjects. The working classes were still the subjects of change in the world. And we were interviewing them about their past in order to understand the future. And by the way, there is a mimosa, the flower. It was probably the 8th of March, in 77. So we interviewed largely leftist workers, not only, but largely. Actually, it was very difficult to find some worker who accepted, all workers who accepted to say he had been fascist or she had been fascist. But anyway, there was intersubjectivity understood as a concomitance and convergence of worldviews. Then in the following period, before, it's all right to show this, but before I must bridge the gap between these two images. In the 1980s and early 90s, the other type of intersubjectivity I practice in methodology of research was still of the same type, in the sense that I had big projects of 1968ers, which produced various books, and on women and feminists. So this intersubjectivity developed, but was inspired by the same idea of learning from somebody who was the subject of history and of change. Now, this concept of a subject of change and history has somehow vanished, although not completely, but the next slide shows interviews with one with Eva Leitner, and the other one, can we see the second one, with Ursula Beaman. Now, the interviews with artists were of completely different type, and the intersubjectivity at play was different. It was no longer a question, interview was no longer based on a biographical question. It was rather on the theory and vision of the artist and the comparison between her work and the material we were collecting. And the reactions of these two artists was very different. Both were very generous in allowing us to use their works for showing in classes and to people and in presentations. But while Ursula Beaman was very adamant in stating that her type of visual memory collected, like in Sahara Chronicle that we saw at the beginning, or Europlex, is a completely different type of memory process than the one we were asking for from our interviewees, which I thought was extremely instructive, because we had assumed too simply that there was a parallelism somehow. Eva Leitner was more how shall I say, flexible, in the sense that she saw every effort to construct a controversy, a contested memory of Europe and mobility was going in the same direction. In her mind, there was a meeting of the two types of memory. So I'm just presenting these two different positions, different types of interviews, different type of intersubjectivity between them and me, and different type of intersubjectivity between them and the mobile people. This is the crucial point I want to come to, which is we had constructed a mediated intersubjectivity between one type of memory and the other type of memory. It was mediated in the sense that it was not direct. And as such, it must be interpreted, understood. May we see the next two slides? This is from Mohammed, who is a Syrian, a young Syrian, who made many photographs. He took many photographs of his trip. Among these photographs, there is this, when he moved, of the boat, when he moved from Turkey to Greece. And look at the next slide. This is similar boat by Ai Weiwei. Now, here you can see the distance and the parallelism at the same time. A symbol, like the boat has become a symbol. Ai Weiwei created an installation on Palazzo Strozzi in Florence, in which the old palazzo is covered with boats like this, which enraged the Florentines. But so he certainly reached his goal. I want to underline that the two memories, although apparently similar, cannot be really compared. Cannot be really compared. It's more complicated than this, and we can talk about these types of visual memories. And finally, visuality, mobility, memory, corporeality, bodies across borders, the body. This was essential. Visuality was the way for us to understand corporeality. Visuality is the visuality of the body and its products. And so we had 3 exhibitions out of this project, and one in the Archivio, the State Archive in Florence, included a performance. Okay, this performance, her name is Erika Zueneli, and his is Olivier Renouf. You see the drawings, the images were up on the walls in the Archivio di Stato, and the artists, the performers stayed several days in the exhibition and learned about the stories, and finally produced a performance. And it was a way for us to give back another form of intersubjectivity. The intersubjectivity is intercorporeality, is also intercorporeality, or always, even in the case of the interview. Then I took the liberty to add a final slide, final image. Intersubjectivity through art and through the ages. Pontormo, 1500, the visitation of Anna and Maria, and Bill Viola rendering of this in a video in which It's a very, very slow movement, very, very slow. I don't want to comment on these elements of intersubjectivity, particularly gendered. I didn't mention gender, but it has been present through the research. Space is gendered. It's the first images I showed were of women, and bodies are not neutral. Bodies are gendered. And these works of art from the past and from the present show us in a very pregnant way, and perhaps better than words, what intersubjectivity can mean in terms of intercorporeality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luisa. Thank you really very much for your lecture. It was interesting, and of course it was very inspiring, especially for our project. So now it's time for questions. If you have questions, you can write them down in the topic of chat or questions and answers. So if you want, you can start. Who's going to be the first one? I have a question, of course, as always, Luisa. Was there any interaction between the members of your study when they were presenting one to another their maps of relocations and their stories? How did they connect? Did they connect one with another?
Thank you for this question, Kaja. They were indeed, and sometimes very polemical. For instance, when AbdulSuse presented his itinerary, you remember him from going from Mali through Libya and desert and to Lampedusa. He came to a part where he was in Libya and he said that Maghrebian people are racist. They would stop me in the road and say, "What are you African doing here?" And I said, "But this is Africa also." And somebody from the audience, actually a person who had been an interpreter of Arabic into Italian for many years and came from Egypt, protested vibrantly. So there was a big discussion, very big discussion. Who is racist, who is African, and so on. And in the end, after many exchanges, there was this Solomonic conclusion that every people has something good and bad individuals and good individuals. And there was so this was a type of exchange. Sometimes the exchange was within families, like in the case of Peruvian. The Peruvians constitute a large community. They actually constitute a very large community in Europe. And so sometimes the exchange took place within the family, which is a different. And it is not new for oral history. The dynamic between genders and generations was evident. The dynamic between generations is very interesting because it shows the transmission of memory from one generation to the other. Like young people will say, "Oh, Grandpa, tell that story you told us," and so on. Actually, not many old people were. I mean, we found older people for the nationalities like from Morocco or the Maghreb. From Peru, it was more difficult, for instance, to find old people. So the question of age and interactions also. So yes, and the other interaction I could mention is between how the interviewees reacted to our showing the art, visual art. It was very interesting because they reacted participating completely in the story that they saw the images from the point of view of the story they narrated. So, these women, we know how difficult it is, or things like that. So we reported these reactions to the artists. So you see multiple interactions were created. And I forgot to mention one very important interaction. Some of the components of the teams were originally one from Serbia, the other from Mexico, from various parts of the world. So their first, they wrote about this. The first reaction in front of the interviewee was a reciprocal recognition as being migrants. We both are from outside of Europe. And then they were actually quite vocal in transforming this corporeal, existential intersubjectivity into a methodological tool. Because actually, you see, this led us to question the juxtaposition between mobility and sedentarism. Nobody's completely mobile, or nobody is completely sedentary. There are histories of migration in each family. And so the rigid juxtaposition between mobility and immobility is false.
Yeah. Okay. Catherine, do you have any questions?
Yes, I have one question. Of course, I could ask a lot. Thank you very much for your presentation, Luisa. You said that when you got the white sheet, it was in the beginning of your presentation, you got a white sheet back from one of your participants in the seminars, and you were trying to interpret it, and you said that you not only try to interpret, but you also offered different kind of channels of communication. You offered to talk, you offered to draw, you offered different possibilities, but you choose in this project, which you presented, mainly maps. You chose that they got a paper and they could draw something. So my question to you would be, from all these possibilities they could tell about their migration stories, what was the extra layers you thought you will get out of, and maybe you got out of using this map strategy? What were the extra information which you would not have gotten when you would have just asked a question? What are the layers you don't see?
Thank you for this question, Catherine. By the way, this my presentation today has particularly shown the drawings, but we have many photographs, and we have also little videos, small videos done with the cellular phones, the cell phones. And so that they had produced during the trip, or that they produced being after being asked. So the proportion, the overwhelming proportion of drawings that I showed does not correspond to the real amount of relationship between the two types. We had a preference for the manual because we thought that there was a way of representing. I had this idea of challenging the idea of counter-geography, which I rather criticize rather harshly. I mean, there are all sorts of writings in anthropology, cultural history, so on, geography also, about alternative geography or counter-geography, as if the production of visual images by people from different cultures than the traditional European one were simply anti-existing geography. This is, to me, is a very reductive thing. These images, whether by photograph or by cell phone or by drawing, are expression of individual stories, narrations that not necessarily have simply or merely the purpose of challenging the traditional view of Western geography. So I personally thought it would be easier if one had this freedom that the white page represents. Also can be scaling, but you have to use the photograph in a very special way in order to be able to show what one goes through. For instance, to show the void like light does. So I became aware during the course of 5 years of research of the risks of asking for drawings. But I will do it again. It was very moving. It created a type of participation. And it could be avoided. Those who didn't want to draw either wrote or spoke or brought to the classroom or to the group, the voluntary group, brought photographs, and not necessarily done by themselves, done by others. So there was quite a freedom, but there was a freedom of expression, I think, as much as we could guarantee. But this did not conceal two things. First of all, how shall I say? I talk also about visual intersubjectivity, which is a rather new and vague concept. But by this I mean that these people tried voluntarily to find a common ground in visual terms between us and them, not at all in order to underline the us and we and they, these divisions, but on the contrary, to find points of convergence, to find points of understanding. One of the aims of this project was that what is European identity? What is a European sense of belonging? Is there any such thing? The thing is much more complicated than these terms can make us think. There are many ways of being in Europe, feeling belonging to Europe, multiple ways of being, multiple forms of identity. And there are already, in spite of the growing racism and xenophobia, there are already many spaces of communication and of finding common ground. There are in schools, for instance. Thanks to teachers. I should have mentioned that the role of teachers in this research was very important.
Luisa, we have two other questions if you want. Yeah, I can combine them together because actually they are all talking about the artistic expression. One much more into the way of giving voice to the refugees from writings. So Tatiana Peric is asking, how do you view the role of technology in giving voice to the refugees, and not only in the area of visual arts? For instance, she says that there is the case of Bucciani and his novel written through WhatsApp messages. So what do you think about the voice of the refugees through new media technology? And at the same time, Martina is also asking if you can say something more about the difference between the artistic representation rendering on the topic of migration and the biographical one. So the questions are very similar, connected to the artistic expression, but in a very different ways.
The second question means, what do you mean, the biographic one? The type of biographic interview?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I am completely in favor of any use of any technology, of any new media for documenting the voice of people. And we did a documentary. I just now see actually we did 3 documentaries. One was done by the interviewees themselves. One was done by an expert. It is visible on YouTube. I sent Kaja a table of links that document the visual and the publications by Babe, the research, so you can see the documentary. And there is also, on our website, we still have the website, the European University Institute website. There are two documentaries done by the people themselves. So documentary has been used. I personally had thesis, doctoral and not doctoral thesis done on email messages, WhatsApp messages is fine, so whatever. Actually, what comes out is that human communication goes beyond the technology. It uses it. It's not suffocated by it. People have been using Skype for condolences in the case of funerals, things like that. So any technological mean is welcome if you use it properly. And the difference between the artistic and the biographic, I'm not sure I understood the question, because I wonder whether it is posed in terms of methodology of the interview, or is it? No, what I meant when I mentioned this difference, talking about Eva Leitner and Ursula Beaman, meaning simply that I didn't use with them the approach, the biographical approach, which is the approach I've used for all my research projects on workers, women, 68ers, which was a request for the story of their lives, encountering many resistances, but also an interesting type, which was not completely free. There is no completely free approach to interviewing. It was, I had in mind a series of points that had to be touched, but I left, in a biographic interview, I leave, if I do it now, the interviewee, the narrator, speak their own, follow their own structure if they want. And I here and there support them or add or ask something. In this type of artistic interview, it was completely different. It was interviews. I don't think they would even have accepted, either of them, a biographic interview. They were interested in talking about the work, the theory behind the work, the impact of the work, the political value of what they did, very much so. But I mean, the political and the action, the impact against the media that the work represented. And this was a big block of questions. And the other block was, how does this compare with the other collection of visual memory? First of all, do you see yourself as producing a visual memory of Europe, European borders and so on? Yes. And yes, and how? And secondly, how do you see the fact that we are collecting other memories of Europe that we can show you? So this was the other type of interview.
Yes. Yeah. I'm putting the links in the chat. So Darselam is asking, I admire your interpretation of spaces, movement, of gender bodies. You have talked about the drawings by Yusef, and you mentioned the notion of Islamic abstract. Can you further elaborate on that?
Well, I think the question is double, because it starts talking about faces. Actually, I think faces are very important, and I could see, I could feel, I could sense your reaction when behind the drawing, behind the image, you could see the face of the person. I could not show the image of the person who did the photograph of the boat, Mohammed, because he was too young at the time, so he's a minor, I cannot show his image. And you feel the lack. You feel something is missing. And even for the artists, seeing their faces is important. No, couldn't show them all, but it adds something. It's part of this corporeality of the relationship with in interviewing. So this is the first part on the faces. The second is, what was it? Gender and
It was the notion of Islamic abstract.
Sorry. I was still thinking of the gender because this question of the face has also an important gendered aspect. For instance, I couldn't show them now, but some of the women we interviewed did not want their image shown because of religious reasons. Some of them did, but they are almost completely veiled or largely veiled. So there is a mark of gender, which is, for instance, Adawa also is largely covered to some extent. So there is a question of, I would call it the intersectionality of gender, in the sense that gender must be always combined with class, place, age, and so on, even for images. Okay, this is a whole discourse. I think it's very interesting. Islamic, yes, it's too simple to say that for me that Yusef Bocuse produced that extraordinary map based on the initial of his name, attributing it to a preference for the abstract as against figurativity. I think that from his speech, from his reflections, there is a very individual aspect that I would give large part to in any interpretation. His idea of, by the way, he was born on the 1st of January 1978, and that for him was another sign of destiny. So a number of elements in his oral interview and comment point out to the fact that he considered himself somehow unique. Well, everybody is, but anyway, he is correct in thinking of himself in this way. And he expresses also a relative indifference to whether settling down, they have to decide, he and his fiancée, settling down in Turin or in Grenoble. That doesn't make much difference. In any case, I want to go to Brussels, I want to go to Paris, and so I would give the individual, I wouldn't consider anything ever in an interview as a simple example of a general law. Generalization and exemplification. I think so often oral history and cultural history does this, states a general law and then the individual is called to support that. This is very unfair, both to the general law and to the individual. These are two different scales. The collective, the general, the presupposition, the theoretical hypothesis, and the individual experience.
Okay, I think that we have to stop here because we said 1 hour and now we are already 1 hour and 20 minutes. If we will get more questions, can I mail them to you?
To me?
Yes.
Of course, okay. Gladly. Okay. I would be glad.
I will put you in contact with some of the attendees of the webinar. Luisa, thank you very much. It was an inspiring talk and everyone is saying thank you. So hopefully you inspired a lot of people to do good researches themselves.
And thank you so much. I actually look forward to participating as a listener to some of your webinar, particularly the one of empathy, because empathy is a clue to intersubjectivity. So we can end on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And for all of you, see you next week on our webinar about empathy. So have a great weekend and see you next week. Thank you, Luisa, very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.